Okay, welcome back everyone to World Civilizations 2. I am Dr. Ross with you again to continue the story of World War II that I just began for our last lecture. Now we have a lot to cover today, and just a couple preparatory remarks before I begin telling the story. One is that about 3/4 of the way through the lecture, some of the imagery in this particular lecture gets a bit graphic. I think it's important to see, but just a heads up that is going to happen. Second is that in this lecture I try and cover quite a bit of material, some of which I have to go through fairly quickly, but if you are interested in this, we do offer a full course on World War II, offered alternately by Dr. Wiest and Dr. Abra here in the History Department. So, as I said last time, just by way of introducing World War II, World War II is different than other wars that came before it. The only one, to my mind, that really compares is actually the 30 Years' War of the 17th century. And that's primarily because the meaning of total war in the 20th century changed shape between World War I and World War II. World War I, as our lecture and textbook emphasized, was total war insofar as it required the mobilization of entire populations to fight it. So World War I was a total war because all of the belligerents had to totally devote their entire political, social, and economic systems towards winning the war. And that involved mobilizing untold numbers of young men through the draft. It meant controls on the economy. It meant allowing and encouraging women to enter the workforce, that sort of thing. World War II has all of that as well. But what makes World War II total war, in addition, is that it is not fundamentally a war between armies. It is not a war that you can really understand by thinking about people in uniform shooting or bombing one another. Rather, it is a war conducted on both sides in important ways against civilians. World War II is fundamentally a war of armies against civilians. And that is what leads to the massive casualties with which the war will end, as well as the total and incredible devastation of basically the entirety of continental Europe, with a couple major exceptions. The city of Paris, for instance, survives the war fairly unscathed. But World War II, unlike World War I, will witness the disappearance of entire communities, mostly located in Eastern Europe. Communities eliminated due to their ethnicity, their nationality, and most importantly, their religion, the Jewish religion in particular. But that is not to say that the Allies, those fighting the fascists, Britain, the United States, Soviet Union, and for briefly, France, did not also carry out attacks on civilian populations. And indeed, targeting civilian populations became one of the key tactics employed by all sides. So here we think, and the reason I want to mention this now, because I won't have time in the course of the lecture to really go into detail, think the firebombing of Dresden, of other German cities, but most particularly, well, conclude the lecture today with Hiroshima. I do not begin this lecture with this definition of total war, my emphasis on both sides, in order to argue that both sides are equal, or that both sides are equally morally at fault. Unlike World War I, there was no question of which side was at fault, which side was morally bankrupt. It's the Axis, it's the Germans, it's the Italians. And indeed, if you ask most Germans, Italians, unfortunately not really the Japanese, they will agree with that statement. So I'm not arguing that both sides, this is not a both sides claim, but it is an attempt to nuance our understanding of what this war meant. There is no good war. And the American myth that this is one is just that. It is a myth. And it is one that we need to do away with. Indeed, in some ways, the myth begins right at the beginning of the war. We conveniently forgot towards the end that when Germany, and this is where I ended my last lecture, when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Soviets were on their side. Our future allies, the Soviet Union, who will win the war in many respects, will ensure that the American and British landing at D-Day will succeed, were on the side of Hitler. And indeed, invaded Poland from the east, carrying out atrocities that were equal to, if not as, that were equal to, I'm not going to start comparing oppression here, equal to what Hitler did in the West. And indeed, the people of Poland, if one does want to play oppression Olympics, have quite the claim to suffering the most through the course of the war. For example, the entire intelligentsia of major Polish cities, in particular Warsaw, were murdered at the beginning of the invasion. So while what I'm about to describe is termed in Western Europe as the phony war, the waiting period for the Nazis to turn west, for Poland, the war had not just begun in September 1939, but was quite real. In any case, the Polish invasion by Germany was a swift success and proved that the German military was quite ready to engage in its military goals of ensuring its conquest of Lebensraum in the east. The German military perfected through the invasion of Poland the strategy of the Blitzkrieg. That's Blitzkrieg, B-L-I-T-Z-K-R-I-E-G, meaning lightning war. The use of quick-moving tank battalions protected by air fire to rapidly dissipate the defending military. It is worth pointing out that Poland will fall in about 3 weeks, but the Polish military is nothing to disregard. They, in fact, were one of the most powerful militaries in the world, being buffeted by both the Soviet Union and by Germany throughout the interwar period, but could not withstand the assault of both. If you're interested, a book by Timothy Snyder, a very important historian named Bloodlands, goes into the details of the Polish situation prior to the war. In any case, after the invasion of Poland, Hitler decides that he will kind of wait out the Soviet Union. Remember, even though the Soviet Union and Hitler have a non-aggression pact, it's to the east that ultimately Germany will go. But what they don't want is to face what they faced in World War I, a two-front war. So instead, Hitler moves west. And indeed, this period is a moment where the Western Allies essentially wait for Hitler to move. The Nazis first move north. Actually, if I go back to my map, they first move north through Scandinavia, and then turn west to prepare for the invasion of France in early 1940. They begin preparing for that invasion with massive aerial bombardments of the Netherlands, of Norway, of Denmark, and then of Belgium. So we can see what I mean by the idea of total war. This is Rotterdam, totally destroyed in the course of the Nazi invasion of 1940. After the invasion of the Netherlands and then of Belgium, the Nazis turned to what they knew would be their most formidable opponent on the continent, that of France. The French had prepared for this war. The French had never quite gotten themselves to see Germany as a possible member of a community of nations. In fact, through the course of the interwar period, they began preparing to fight them again. And that accelerated through the course of the 1930s for reasons I hope I do not have to explain. Indeed, the French had built a line of fortifications along the German border known as the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line is essentially a series of concrete, gigantic bunkers up on the top surface, covering underneath vast complexes of transportation pathways to move the French military quickly and rapidly along the line. So the French believed that they were quite ready for a German advance, that they would be able to fortify their border and force, essentially, the Germans to go through Belgium, where the British and French would meet them and push them back. The Germans, however, didn't go through, at least they didn't go through where the part of Belgium the Allies thought they would. Instead, they go through here, which I know in the slide is probably hard to read, the Ardennes Forest. What the French had calculated by building the Maginot Line to end there is that the Ardennes Forest was supposedly impenetrable to tanks. Supposedly impenetrable to tanks. That was incorrect. The German tank battalions simply rolled through the forest. And when they appeared in French territory, those stationed on the Maginot Line realized quickly that their guns were facing the wrong way, and the British Expeditionary Force in northern France found themselves cut off. And for those of you who saw the film over the summer, really excellent film if you haven't seen it, of Dunkirk, will know all about the successful evacuation of the northern French beaches of the British Expeditionary Force to fight another day after they were cut off by the German army. The French military, the French army, in the wake of the invasion of Germany and the failure of the Maginot Line, essentially falls apart. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, but the French army eventually fails to recover. The political government refuses to carry on the fight, and in June 1940, France agrees to an armistice, eventually forming a collaborationist government, which your textbook talks about a little bit, in the spa city of Vichy in southern France. The reason I want to bring up Vichy briefly today is not simply that I'm a French historian, I find it interesting, but that it's important to note that of all the conquered territories, all the conquered nations of Europe, it is only the French that agree to collaborate with the Germans. And I mean agreed to. The French were not forced. The French formed a policy within the government to seek out ways of collaborating with the Germans because they thought the Germans were going to win the war. It is true that a Free French force led by the General Charles de Gaulle does begin forming a government in exile in London, but that government in exile will not be recognized by the United States, for instance, by any major power until around 1942, I believe. So the French actually have quite a bit to answer for as well in this whole story. Indeed, when it came time for the Germans to ask France to send them their Jewish population, their Jewish citizens, they only asked for adults, and the French police sent children as well. There are no black and white in this story. It's all gray. In any case, with the fall of France, Germany turns to its major remaining opponent, that of Great Britain, in what will become the Battle of Britain, 1940-1941. Hitler knew how difficult it would be to launch an invasion of the British Isles. No one had succeeded in doing so since 1066 with William the Conqueror. So Hitler's idea is to essentially send over massive waves of bombings to do two things. One is to prepare militarily for an invasion, to knock out fortifications along the British beaches and prepare the way for an amphibious assault of the island. And second, to force the civilian population into despair so that they will lose faith in their political leaders to carry on the war and will want to sue for peace. Once those two things would happen, military success and civilian despair, Hitler would be able to launch what they called Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. That is not how things went down. And in fact, the Battle of Britain becomes the first true setback for the German advance. But it was not without cost. By the time the Battle of Britain was over 40,000 British civilians had been killed by bombing raids over civilian targets. The success of the British Royal Air Force, however, eventually pushes back the British Air Force and ensures that Britain will be able to carry on the war. It's at this moment that Winston Churchill, so well known for his turn of phrases, another subject of a Dunkirk movie, argues that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed to so many by so few. He's referring to the about 250 British Spitfires and Hurricanes that meet the German bombers and force them to abandon the notion of an amphibious landing of Great Britain. With Britain determined to stay in the war, despite the regular bombings, Hitler has to decide what to do. The state of affairs in Europe itself are not quite stable, and he has an ideological and kind of personal conviction that it is in the East that the German future truly lays. That the peace he had struck in 1940 with Joseph Stalin could not hold. And that Hitler would be the one to succeed where people like Napoleon had failed in an invasion of the Soviet Union. So after invading Yugoslavia, Greece, he begins to prepare for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. That invasion goes well in 1941. And so here we have the German advance through the course of 1941. By early 1942, I'm going to come back to Operation Barbarossa in a second. By early 1942, Hitler is essentially in control of all of continental Europe and a significant portion of the Soviet Union. You can see how far they're advancing under military administration. We're going to come back to Operation Barbarossa because Operation Barbarossa is not simply important for the military story of World War II, which I will conclude. It is also significant for the story of the Holocaust. And note, these are two different but intertwined stories. When Hitler invades Eastern Europe, he finds himself in control of the majority of the continent's Jews. That was not true until he invaded Eastern Europe. So it's only with Operation Barbarossa of 1941 that the Holocaust and the murder of Europeans' Jews, eventually 6 million of them, becomes not simply conceivable, it was already conceivable, but possible. So if you get Operation Barbarossa on your exam, don't forget, it's not just the military success, it's its link to the Holocaust that explains its significance. I do need to pause, however, in 1942 with the German Empire at its most advanced, to turn back to Asia briefly. The focus of this lecture will be on Europe, but it's important to keep in mind this is a global war. While Hitler was advancing in Europe, their allies in Japan were doing the same in Asia. I already explained the initial invasion of Manchuria, 1931, its creation of a puppet state of Manchukuo in the mid-1930s, followed by the invasion of the Chinese mainland in 1937, leading to the Japanese atrocities of the Nanking massacre or the rape of Nanking. With the Japanese invasion of the Chinese mainland, vast swaths of the country were taken over, and they managed to set themselves up in the European colonies of Southeast Asia. The resistance within China, however, was fierce, and an ongoing civil war within China between communists and nationalists, we're going to have you read about that, was put on hold in favor of fending off the Japanese invasion. The resistance in China led to stalemate within the Japanese advance. Resistance in China led to stalemate for Japan. So as Germany over in Europe is advancing, Japan is having a little more trouble expanding its empire in Asia. They do, as I already said, gradually expand their goals to the European colonies as European powers fall, but they could only extend it so far before butting up against holdings by none other than the United States. And indeed, the Japanese expansion into the Pacific, so if China is not going to work out, at least not smoothly, neither is the Pacific because of the presence of the United States. And it's at that moment that the Japanese military command begin conceiving of the possibility of a defensive attack, if you want to put it that way, on the United States. The idea, according to Japan, is to eliminate the capacity of the United States to wage naval warfare against their expansion in the Pacific through a surprise attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japan justified the surprise attack that did occur on December 7, 1941, a day, according to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that would live in infamy, by arguing that it was an anti-colonial adventure intended to defend the rights of Asians as a whole. Japan promised to push out European and American imperialists and essentially replace them with themselves. The attack on Pearl Harbor, however, did not succeed, and I'm sure you all are already familiar with this, at preventing the United States not only from entering the war, but being able to successfully carry it out on both fronts. And that's where the United States is somewhat unique in this conflict. The Soviets, as powerful as they are, remain engaged in Europe. Germany engaged in Europe and Africa. Japan, Asia, the United States engages both Europe and Asia. The failure of the attack on Pearl Harbor was in part due to the fact that the American naval capacity was actually out to sea at the time. In any case, after the attack, the United States declares war on Japan. Once the United States declares war on Japan, the Nazi Germany declares war on the United States, which enables Franklin Delano Roosevelt to justify entering the war against Germany as well. But if you're interested, it was a little bit of a concern for him. Roosevelt wanted to enter the war against Germany, but he was a little worried that Congress would only approve a war against Japan. Hitler gave him the opportunity. And I put up this image, which is Hitler declaring war on the United States, in part because of how striking it is, but also to emphasize the confluence of events that allowed the United States to enter the war on both fronts. And indeed, it's in Europe that Roosevelt believes he had to start. That the war in Europe would be the primary focus of the United States military, and then they would turn to Japan. They're both going on simultaneously, but they want to defeat Germany first. Okay, so turning back to Europe. The invasion of the Soviet Union seemed to promise the Nazi regime the Lebensraum, the living space, that they had been so deeply concerned with achieving. And indeed, at first it seemed that they were going to succeed. At first it seemed they were going to succeed. In the initial invasion, I want some numbers. Yeah, with the initial invasion of the war, the German army was able to take almost 5 million Soviet soldiers, that's obviously over the course of the invasion as a whole, taken prisoner, many of which were forced to labor in, forced labor camps, but were slave labor camps, in order to feed the German military machine. Conquered territories were put under the control of a Nazi administration, all geared towards ensuring that the Nazi regime would be able not to fend off Britain, maintain control, and establish the new world order, largely revolving around the Nazi racial ideology that I described last time and that you can read about as well in your textbook. The invasion led individuals within these conquered territories to have to make incredibly difficult choices. Eastern Europeans, and we did not talk about this too much in class, though I did reference it if you think about the Ukraine. Eastern Europeans, for instance, had just finished being terrorized and starved to death by Stalin. Now they're going to be terrorized and starved to death by Hitler. What do you do in that kind of situation? To fend off one invading power would simply be to invite the other one back in. People of all sorts suffered horrendously in this context. However, the main targets of the German racial program remained the Jewish people. And it's with the invasion of the Soviet Union that the murder of the Jews of Europe became possible. The Nazis had already begun to prepare for doing something about the Jews prior to the war. Through the course of the 1930s, in Germany, and then to Austria after the Anschluss in 1938, the Germans put forward a series of anti-Semitic laws that gradually took away German Jewish citizenship. They also began experimenting with eugenic practices targeted not at first at the Jews, but at other so-called undesirables, such as, in particular, disabled people and what they called essentially degenerates, criminals, repeat criminals, that sort of thing. In 1939, the first targeted first targeted eugenic killings begin in Germany itself, targeted at the mentally ill, the T4 euthanasia program. It is in that program not only that the Germans will murder thousands of psychiatric patients, but that they will also begin experimenting with the poison gases that will eventually be used to such effect against the Jewish people. However, the Holocaust, as we know it today, did not begin with mass murder. The Holocaust, as we know it today, began with a process of what was euphemistically called population transfers. Remember, Eastern Europe was meant to be the kind of settler colony of the great German race. And that meant that all the people who were already living there had to be moved, had to be removed. These initial population transfers, quote unquote, were not targeted simply at the Jews, though they were the most affected, but at all of the so-called Untermenschen, the subhumans of Eastern Europe. And that's a big, giant quote around subhumans. That was the term the Nazis used. So people were pushed to the interior of the Soviet Union, or they were forced to continue working on as slaves in Eastern Europe as German settlers were gradually pushed in. The Jews living in these territories were forced into ghettos or were simply shot. And indeed, it's important to remember that over a third of those murdered in the Holocaust were not killed in concentration camps, were not gassed, but were shot with bullets, face to face. Through the process of population transfers and what were called shooting actions, millions would be killed. One of the most famous of these moments, 1941, September, the executions of 33,000 Jews in Ukraine at Babi Yar. You can see these are soldiers going through the dead to ensure nothing valuable is lost. Those who carried out these crimes were following behind the German military as they advanced through the Soviet zone. They were known as Einsatzgruppen, mobile death squads, you can see, mobile execution squads, who followed behind the army, killing civilians on the orders of the Nazi regime. Note what that means. As traditionally understood, the German military maintained some sense of honor through the course of World War II, as distinguished between those who carried out the SS. That is a myth. The two were intensely linked and often carried out each other's duties. So the Einsatzgruppen might have been partially SS, Nazi, but they worked with the cooperation of the German military from the top. The German military, in other words, was quite complicit. Actually, more than complicit. They were murderers in this context. By 1942, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered 500,000 people. By 1943, 2.2 million Jews shot. Shooting, however, takes a long time. You can't simply murder people by bullet that quickly. And so Jews who survived these initial killing actions were forced into ghettos, the most famous of which is the Warsaw Ghetto. There were about 3 million Jews who lived in Poland at the start of the war. The largest community was in Warsaw. It had a pre-war Jewish population of 350,000. That's more than all the Jews in France, just in this one city. After the invasion, the Jewish communities were destroyed by the Germans. The remaining Jews were forced into an incredibly small ghetto. We're talking a small neighborhood intended to maybe house a couple thousand people, now being forced to carry hundreds of thousands of people. The ghetto was sealed off. So if we think about ghettos in either the medieval or the modern era, I don't like using that term for the modern era, but it is in current, you're not sealed off. You can still move between the outside and the ghetto. You can't do that in this context. They are sealed in, and all food, medicine, and people is strictly controlled by the Nazis. Disease runs rampant. Thousands of people die of things like typhoid. And this is all before the ghettos are emptied and people are forced into the death camps. But this kind of raises the question, how are the Nazis going to deal with all these Jews? The goal was not originally it was not originally genocide. The killings that were taking place through the shooting actions were fairly haphazard. Note the numbers, how quickly they accelerate. I said 500,000 people in 1942, but then 2.2 million in 1943. That's a huge increase. And that huge increase is due to the fact that the Nazis changed strategies as they conquered more and more territory, but then as the war went worse and worse. Indeed, more Jews are going to be murdered as the Nazis continue to begin to realize that they are losing the war. Then they begin to blame the Jews for losing the war, which only increases the amount of Jews they try and kill. The decision to murder the Jews of Europe is made in early 1942. Excuse me. It's made in late 1941 by Hitler himself, and in early 1942, the Nazi elite gathers at a chateau outside of Berlin to figure out how they're actually going to do it. You know, before this, a couple ideas came up. One, the most famous, was to move all the Jews of Europe to Madagascar, which was a French colony. That was impractical for all kinds of reasons. Instead, they decide that murder is the way it's going to happen. At this conference, lists of the remaining Jews of Europe are essentially brought forward, they're collated, and they are marked for death. The transports from the west to the east are planned. The numbers needed to ensure that all the remaining Jews of both Western and Eastern Europe are murdered are established. And a regular machine of murder begins to take shape. Prior to this conference, about 75% of the victims of the Holocaust were still alive. 1 year after this conference, 75% were dead. This required a huge amount of manpower and dedication to ensuring that it worked. The Nazis set up a large-scale system of concentration and extermination camps. Note the difference: concentration camps keep people, extermination camps kill them. That would feed into the primary locations of the murder here in Eastern Europe. Only one camp, actually no extermination camps properly defined existed in Germany itself. The killing was to occur elsewhere. The most famous of the extermination camps was, of course, that of Auschwitz. Actually, let me, Auschwitz, right here in Poland. Between the spring of 1942 and the fall of 1944, 1 million people will be killed at Auschwitz alone. The bodies were then buried in large pits, or they were burned in the huge crematoria that would then rain down ashes on the remaining prisoners. I have some images of Auschwitz. I have very little to say about them, except that they're important for you to see. I will mention this one. Selection is the moment at the arrival at Auschwitz where German doctors would decide whether a Jew is worth more alive or dead. Largely that had to do with your capacity to work, but it could be quite arbitrary as well. And you simply were pointed life, death, life, death. The Nazis used Zyklon B gas at the extermination camps. The gas was developed first through the euthanasia program, then was used in mobile gas trucks that followed in the Einsatzgruppen when they weren't shooting people, where they would simply poison people by carbon monoxide or began using the poison gas itself. By October 1941, they were building gas chambers at selected extermination camps to facilitate mass murder. Life in the camps was incredibly, I can't express in a brief lecture what it was like. I can never express what it was like. Terror was the daily experience. If you're interested, I have a number of memoirs that I would recommend. One is by one of the figures pictured here, Elie Wiesel, Night. I would also suggest Primo Levi, Survival in Auschwitz, and my preferred book, when I teach this, Still Alive by Ruth Kluger. The mass murder was not hidden. These photographs themselves show that people knew what was happening and they were documenting it, and sometimes with the permission of those who carried it out. People knew that this happened. It is a myth that no one knew. It is a myth. Lots of people understood. You could see the smoke in both German and Polish cities. I'm going to move to a different slide. What about governments? Governments also knew. That's both the Allied and the Axis. Level of cooperation, of course, varied. One of the great tragedies of there's so many. One of the great tragedies of World War II was the fate of the Hungarian Jews. Hungary was allied with Hitler. But for a variety of reasons, some of which simply had to do with a desire to maintain a sense of independence vis-a-vis the Nazis, the Hungarian government did not give up their Jewish population to the Nazi extermination machine. They survived until March 1944, when the Germans took direct control of Hungary and sent about 12,000 Hungarian Jews a day to Auschwitz. 600,000 Hungarian Jews would die. One question that often comes up in the in-person version of this course is the question of resistance. It is a mistake to assume that Jews simply accepted their fate and went meekly to the gas chamber. But it is also a mistake to assume that they should have done more to resist. Very little resistance would have been popular, but resistance did occur. And that ranged from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a violent attempt to overthrow the Germans, to suicide as a form of resistance. In total, between 4 and 6 million Jews will die in the Holocaust. It's 6 million, excuse me. 6 million Jews die in the Holocaust. In some areas, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, entire Jewish communities will be wiped off the face of the planet. So we have Holocaust deaths in this chart. You can see that Jews form about a third of the total. Note the high proportion of Soviet prisoners of war and those civilians caught up in the war effort. What is different about the blue portion is that the Jews were specifically targeted. I'm going to move on in a second, but it is also worth pointing out that Jews were not the only population explicitly targeted. They were simply the largest and the most prioritized. As I mentioned last time, the disabled, Roma, the Gypsies, in other words, the Sinti were targeted. Jehovah's Witnesses were political prisoners. Gay men were not targeted for extermination, but often for sterilization. There are many victims of the Holocaust, of which the Jews are the most prominent, significant for both us and for the Nazis themselves. I'm actually going to move past, I don't want to go too long, so I'm going to move past this quote from your text, but if you did not read it, I really highly recommend you think about what Himmler, the leader of the SS, tells his soldiers about their need to kill their Jewish neighbors. Okay, I'm going to take a drink of water. And conclude the war. All of that is happening while the war itself is ongoing. And it was never a high military priority to stop the Holocaust. It was a high military priority to defeat the Nazis. Here are the major Allied campaigns to push back the German war machine. First in North Africa, but then for our purposes, most prominently, the Battle of Stalingrad, and then D-Day. And then I'll also move back around to talk briefly about the war in the Pacific. So when the Nazis invaded Russia, Stalin called on the Allies to form a second front in the West. But it was only after the Soviets successfully defeated the invading Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad that they were able to do so. And it's that reason why Stalingrad is the true turning point of the war. I know most of you are Americans, and I grew up, learning about World War II in my civics class, and what I'm about to describe, D-Day, is the most important thing to ever happen in the history of the war. It is the Soviets who enable the Allies to win this war. And you can think about the death count. 20 million Soviet citizens will die in this war. And that's because they are physically throwing their bodies in front of an invading German force. When the Germans reached Stalingrad, having failed to take Leningrad despite a siege of over a year, and despite not having been able to take the capital of Moscow, The Germans invade Stalingrad, and I mean that literally. They are in the streets. They are urban fighting. They are fighting an urban war, which provides an advantage to those who are from there. Stalin refused to give up this city. As you can see, it's basically destroyed. The Germans are in there. The Soviets are fighting them, but Stalin would not give it up because it bore his name. As the Germans encountered, never invade the Soviet Union, really ever, but especially not around winter time. As the Germans realized that they were not equipped for a lengthy winter, they were told to steal the coats of their dead enemies. As their supplies began to run low, the Russian army was able to encircle the city itself with the Germans inside and force the defeat of the German commander, who, it is worth noting, was ordered to fight to the last man, but surrendered instead. 500,000 Axis soldiers died. Russian casualties in the Battle of Stalingrad were over 1 million people. After Stalingrad, the Soviet Red Army was able to begin pushing the Germans back. By 1944, by spring 1944, they had retaken the Ukraine. Poland, the German occupiers were collapsing, and the Soviets were able to take back parts of Czechoslovakia. The dream of Lebensraum in the East by 1944 was at an end. Oop, wrong way. The dream of Nazi supremacy in the rest of Europe came to an end with the invasion of France by the Allies in D-Day, June 6, 1944. This isn't the first second front that the Allies formed. The first was in Italy, where the soft underbelly of Europe with the invasion from the south. But they were caught in stalemate after the Germans actually invaded Italy and were able to hold the Allies off from invading from there. On June 6, 1944, after a series of diversions, the British, American, Canadian, Australian, etc., never forget, this is not simply an American invasion. It is not an American victory. It is an Allied victory. They successfully land and form a beachfront in Normandy, in the north of France. Casualties are quite high. For those of you who saw many of the films about D-Day, but especially perhaps Saving Private Ryan, you know that. But careful planning enabled the Allies to secure a beachfront in northern France and begin the process of pushing south towards Paris. And indeed, at this moment, things began to move very quickly. By August 1944, these are American GIs looking at the Eiffel Tower. By August 1944, the Allies, including Free French troops, retook Paris, the capital of France. By then, the Russian army had managed to take Prague and Vienna, and by late April, they were about to enter. After this moment, they were able to begin to enter Berlin. And indeed, it's at this moment, Dr. Haynes will pick up this part of the story in a moment. After the defeat of the final German offensive of the Battle of the Bulge, the Soviets and the Allies begin racing towards Berlin, trying to gobble up as much territory now between them, which begins, in many senses, the Cold War. As you might already know, the Soviets get to Berlin first. This is a propaganda image. The battle is over by the time the hammer and sickle is being placed on top of the Reichstag, concluding the war in Europe with victory over Europe Day, May 8th, 1945. About a week, about 8 days after Hitler had killed himself in his secret bunker in the city. The war, however, does not end with the defeat of the Germans. It has to end with the defeat of the Japanese as well. The war in the Pacific will end 4 months after the war in Europe, as Americans and Japanese fight to the last man in various islands. I put up this particular propaganda image, not because it's the most racialized or racist propaganda image the Americans will use for the course of the war, but the use of the term Jap, J-A-P, and excuse me a bit, indicates the ways in which the Americans too participated in racial politics, certainly of a different kind than the Germans. And some historians would argue that it is the racialization of the Japanese as a different kind of people that enabled the Americans to eventually drop the atomic bomb without too much, well, that's unfair, to do something they might not have done in Europe. In any case, the strategy followed by the Americans on the way to Japan was a process of what they called island hopping. Rather than take every single island on the way to the Japanese mainland, they would take strategically important ones to cut off Japanese bases and supplies from one another. Perhaps the most famous of these battles are those of Iwo Jima and their Okinawa. Those of you interested, I'm going to keep recommending movies. Iwo Jima, the film by Clint Eastwood called Letters from Iwo Jima, which kind of takes on the Japanese side of the war, is really a surprisingly grayscaled, literally and metaphorically, film on this process. Once the US and the British allies got to Okinawa, in launching distance of the Japanese mainland, the Allies called on Japan to surrender or be destroyed. When they refused, the US makes the decision to use a secret weapon that they had been developing, an atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, a single American plane drops an atomic bomb, the first to ever be used on a civilian target, on the city of Hiroshima. 60% of the city is destroyed from the single blast. 3 days later, they do the same thing to the city of Nagasaki, the second and only time an atomic bomb has been dropped on a civilian population. I emphasize that because it is something we don't talk too much about in this country. Something to consider, the morality of essentially ushering in the atomic age by dropping these weapons of untold power on civilian populations. The goal was to prevent the death and destruction that would have occurred in the course of an invasion of Japan, and in that the US was successful. On August 14th, Japan surrendered unconditionally. But it is worth considering the cost. And indeed, in dropping the bomb, the US had changed the nature of our relationship between science and political power forever. We could now destroy the world. Literally, we could destroy the world. And that fact that the United States ushered in that will shape the Cold War politics that will follow. In any case, with the Japanese surrender on August 15th, 1945, World War II came to a close. In the end, nearly 50 million people died in World War II. 25 million Soviets, only 8.5 million were in the military. That's right here, all the way up to, I guess, 24 million, excuse me. 20% of the entire Polish population, 90% of Polish Jews, 1 million people from Yugoslavia, 4 million German soldiers, 500,000 German civilians, and 292,000 US soldiers. The United States, where are we? There we are, United States. Note the equality between blue bar and red bar. Blue bar are military deaths. Total deaths as percentage of population. Orange bar is civilian deaths and this is the color military deaths. We only have military deaths. I mean, that's somewhat of an exaggeration, but the United States only has military deaths, and it's in comparison a small number. Our experience of this war is fundamentally different than the Soviet Union. 24 million people dead, most of whom were civilians. It is actually, I mean, I'm going to conclude, I promise. In many senses, the distinction and experience between the United States and the Soviet Union in World War II can tell us a lot about a present-day conflict between the two countries. But what I really want to emphasize is that we should consider our own memory of World War II and how it shapes our understanding of military encounter going forward. So, thank you for bearing with me, and we will see you next time for something that's a little lighter a bit.